Hello and welcome everybody. My name is Leonie Wheeler and I'm the Honorary CEO of the Australian Learning Communities Network. I'm also an Associate of the School of Global, Urban and Social Studies, RMIT University, and a board member of Pascal International Observatory. Thank you for being here and I'm delighted to be your MC for today's webinar. This is being hosted by Adult Learning Australia in partnership with the ALCN, Pascal International Observatory and the European Centre at RMIT University as part of the Global Learning Festival. Also, our local government partners are the City of Hume and the City of Melton. To begin, I acknowledge the traditional owners on the lands from which we all come today and where learning takes place across Australia and globally. I particularly acknowledge the Wurundjeri Wurrung people of the Kulin Nation, who are the traditional owners of the area I come from. I acknowledge the richness that our Aboriginal community members bring to our lands across Australia and their learning that has been passed across generations for thousands of years. And I invite you to tell us where you are coming from today in the chat. And while you do this, I will introduce also our other facilitators for today. Firstly, it gives me great pleasure to introduce Robbie Guevara, who is the President of the International Council for Adult Education and a board member for Asia Pacific Global Campaign for Education and an Associate Professor of International Development at RMIT University and Pascal Director for Australia. Also, Jenny McCaffer, who is the CEO of Adult Learning Australia. And I welcome them and thank them for helping us today to be the facilitators. And you can see when they will do their part. We're starting off with an opening speaker and followed by a short address by Robbie, and then Robbie will introduce the panel members, and also we will then have our local government people speak. Bruce Wilson will give us a reflection on learning and innovation ecosystems between the City of Hume and the City of Melton. We then have a Q&A session facilitated by Robbie and a summary in the current context. So we're showcasing innovation and learning within local government. Learning for and in the workplace is a key building block of the UNESCO Learning City or region. In addition, COMPETIA 7, Marrakesh Framework for Action for Adult Learning and Education is committed to creating flexible learning pathways within and between types of work, recognition of prior learning, the validation and accreditation of non-formal and informal learning should include all sections of the population. And so I'd like to commence with our opening speaker. And in the chat, you'll see that Professor Mike Osborne is a Professor of Adult and Lifelong Learning at the University of Glasgow, has a great deal of experience in adult education, VET, higher education research, development and evaluation, and is the Director for the Centre of Research and Development in Adult and Lifelong Learning. He's a great friend of ours, and being a Pascal Director as well is very important, and I congratulated him on being inducted into the International Adult and Continuing Education Hall of Fame in October 2022 for his contribution internationally to adult and lifelong learning. We are very pleased to have Mike speak on an international perspective on the vital role of local and regional government as hubs for delivering SDG 4, the UN Sustainability Development Goals. Over to you, Mike.
Thanks very much, Leonie. Give me a moment to share my screen, which I think I've successfully done now. It's a great pleasure to be with you on this dark evening in Scotland. It's 10 p.m. and winter is certainly with us. I know so often it's been the other way around when Robbie and Bruce and other colleagues have delivered at the end of the day back to Europe. So it's my turn today. I've only got 10 minutes. It's really going to be a very quick overview of some issues that relate to the role of local and regional governments in delivering SDG 4. I mean, you all know what the SDGs are, the Sustainable Development Goals. And it relates to some work that I've done recently, which I'll say a little bit about later. Just in terms of background, I think we all know this as well. More and more people are moving into cities. By 2050, nearly 70 out of 100 people will live in cities. So huge opportunities, but huge risks in relation to rapid and unregulated urbanizations. And here are just some statistics about likely growth of slums. Currently, 1 billion people live in informal settlements. It's expected to be 3 billion by 2025. And as we all know, across the world, and we know very well from the work that we've done, because in one of our projects, the Centre for Sustainable Healthy Learning Cities and Neighbourhoods, we've been working with cities in the Global South. We know all about urban sprawl, the sorts of burdens that's creating on services, resources, infrastructure, and of course, educational institutions. And in a paper that we wrote last year, we've highlighted the fact that education is so important. And as these expansions occur, we find that provision of education becomes inadequate, and the potential benefits of urbanization decline. So the report I'm talking about is something I contributed to earlier this year. You probably have all heard of the High-Level Political Forum of the UN, which monitors the progress that countries around the world are making towards implementing the SDGs. And many parties make contributions to this annual meeting in New York. And I did some work on behalf of United Cities and Local Governments, the Global Task Force of Local and Regional Governments, just on the role of local and regional governments in relation to SDG 4, which is one of the SDGs that was monitored this year. So, and one of the things that we did in the report was just look at local and regional governments, what they've been doing in relation to SDG 4 before the pandemic, and some of their actions during COVID-19. So, I mean, one of the things we can say is that many cities, many local and regional governments around the world recognize that no one SDG operates in isolation. And many go beyond specific SDG targets in order to make sure that there's enhanced provision for education. And there are many examples around the world of a holistic approach. And I've just taken a couple of examples there, which you can read in the report, which is freely available. Bristol in the UK, which has got a one city plan that maps all of the SDGs into a holistic framework. And they, like many cities around the world, contribute to a voluntary local review of progress. This is another UN action. And there's something similar going on in Los Angeles in the US. So I could give a number of other examples of the same thing. Many cities around the world certainly do recognize that SDG 4 doesn't exist in isolation. And here again, I provide some examples. So you can see again in LA, links being made between SDG 4 and targets that relate to reducing poverty, to promoting universal social, economic and political inclusion, and safe and affordable housing, and so on. And there are other examples you can see there from other countries in the world where links are made between SDG 4 and other SDGs. So the key issue essentially is that, I should try and go back. The key the key issues essentially are that many actions touch on more than one target, and cities in particular have got a prominent role because of their proximity to the people they serve. And I'm trying to get rid of something. And their actions are informed by intersecting inequalities that impinge on equal access, that relate not just to education but other services. And there has to be a recognition of the social fragmentation of cities, that cities are not homogeneous. We all know that there are different neighborhoods with different demands, and there's a huge amount of segregation, particularly in relation to schooling. So what we did in this study was look at each of the different targets of SDG 4. And I'm not going to go through, there are several slides I've got here which deal with each one of those targets. I'm not going to go through them in detail. You can all take the slides later, but you can see just this example here, SDG 4.1, free, equitable and quality primary and secondary education. So where city, which is really focusing on the fact that cities typically need to address diverse populations, and many cities around the world have taken steps to address that. And some of the examples here from Flanders, where all schools take a quota of disadvantaged pupils. In Brazil, in Santos, integrating anti-racist and decolonializing curriculum in the schools. And most Nordic countries have got a number of actions that relate to preventing early dropout amongst marginalized groups, particularly indigenous peoples. Another example, SDG 4.2, there's a recognition that early intervention is extremely important, intervention before the age at which children go to schools. And again, some examples that we've pulled out there from France and from Colombia. So again, 4.3, equitable participation in post-secondary education, including university. You'll all know that a focus on widening participation to higher education is commonplace right across the world. And here, luckily, I've chosen as one of the examples, and when we reported that in the report, is the work of Hume, which I know very well, and I know later on someone's going to be talking about the multiversity structure. So a clear role for cities, and Hume is a really good example of being leaders, of actually bringing education into communities which otherwise don't have provision. And I know the multiversity model is now quite well known around the world. So I could go through a number of these today. You're going to be talking about technical and vocational education, in particular, employment, decent jobs and entrepreneurship. And there are many studies that exist about the way in which cities have taken the lead in relation to entrepreneurship education. There's a report from UNESCO called Entrepreneurship Education for Learning Cities, which I'm sure Leonie knows quite well. Gender is extremely important. That statistic, 127 million girls of primary and secondary school age are out of school, is a compelling one. And that's linked to all sorts of other factors, including poverty, geographical isolation, minority status, disability, and so on, what we call intersectionality. And there are many examples around the world of cities taking actions that relate to issues of gender. SDG 4.5 isn't just about gender, it's about other minority groups. And again, you can find examples of actions that cities take around migrants and refugees, indigenous peoples. Again, I've taken an example from Australia, and you could probably find examples of that all around your country. Less probably actions are found around the world in relation to disability, but there is an example there from Gothenburg. Historically, as Robbie will no doubt empathize with, and I said many times indeed, adult education historically has taken a much lower priority for state support, and it is then incumbent on cities to take actions, and all around the world, again, one can see specific actions that have been taken by cities to fill the gap which essentially isn't played by the state. A lot of that is around literacy education, but it's not just around literacy. Learning in later life, for example, as given there in the example of Singapore. And then, of course, there is ensuring learners acquire the knowledge and skills that are needed to promote sustainable development itself. And that's about citizenship, human rights, gender equality, and so on. And again, plenty of examples of cities taking the lead. Leonie mentioned learning city approaches, and one could argue that the learning city approach, which is associated with a coordinated approach, and that's been particularly the case during the COVID crisis, is really important because it contains elements that ensure, for example, that multiple stakeholders work together, a recognition of the need for joined up service provision. And you see examples of that, for example, in Shanghai, of a whole system approach. You see reflection in some cities, the importance for city administrations themselves to become learning organizations, as for example, in the city of Helsinki, and the importance of the private sector, NGOs, and individual citizens. In other words, bringing all potential stakeholders together. And it's not just about formal education, it's about arts and culture. It's not just about one generation, it's about intergenerational learning. And it's also, of course, about celebrating learning, which is what we're doing in this Global Learning Festival. COVID-19, you've probably heard all this before, but when we looked across the world at what cities were doing, we saw all these things that you're probably familiar with, the exacerbation of deep-rooted inequalities and injustices, and that particularly was focused on cities because of the large populations there, where services were poor, and they often were poor in cities. They became poor for disadvantaged groups. And it's not just about individual resilience, it's about the learning system being resilient. There's been a lot of discussion about learning loss. Most of that has been focused on children, but there also has been huge learning loss for adults and in lifelong learning. So digital learning, both a solution and impediment. The crisis has been an impediment for change. We've seen many, many links between education and health, and we've seen, as I said before, the fact that both formal and non-formal learning is a bedrock for combating adversity. Many, many examples, and you can read the report of things that cities have been doing, particularly during the COVID crisis. I won't go into all of those. Final messages: proximity to communities and local stakeholders place cities or local and regional governments in a really privileged role to contribute to SDG 4 objectives. But there's a need for cities to develop multi-level partnership if they're really going to achieve inclusive quality education. Cities need to create improved learning environments and build synergies between the different SDGs. They can support urban hubs for innovation in education and be more prepared and more resilient for the future. They play a key role for lifelong learning, adult education, education for sustainable development, and so on. But we need more efforts to improve the way in which we assess how they make that contribution. And that, I hope, is going to bring me to the end. And here are some references, and you're most welcome to have these slides and the full report if you want it. Thank you.
An amazing amount of work, Mike. Thank you very much for that. I'll just check that we have any questions. I noted that you mentioned both Melton and Hume in your presentation, and you've done at various reports. That report about Melton as with the community hubs during COVID was in your report for the the last Learning City conference in South Korea, wasn't it? So
That's right,
there's that report, which is in your references, and also the multiversity. My question for you is that how do, all of these great examples that you've given in your presentation, we need to be sharing these with other cities more. How does this happen? And have you seen great examples where an idea from one city is taken up by another city?
Well, the organisation that invited me to write the report that I talked about, the contribution of local and regional governments to SDG Forum, was the Educating Cities grouping in Barcelona. And I mean, I have to say that in the Pascal Observatory, we've had a focus on learning cities, UNESCO's focus on learning cities, and we maybe haven't had enough connection with the Educating Cities grouping, which is much more orientated towards Spain, Portugal, and the Latin American countries. But I've seen fantastic examples and case studies in much more detail on their websites. And I know that there's quite a lot of exchange in that Educating Cities movement. I mean, obviously, I would say this, wouldn't I, that we can use the Learning Cities network of Pascal, which is, I've got about 50 cities and other organizations that are part of it. And we've created a whole set of Learning City networks. And the whole idea of that is for cities to exchange with each other. And to a certain degree, and you'll know better than me, Leonie, UNESCO, which has got some 200 plus cities in its global Learning Cities network, has broken them up into subgroups for exchange. Have
Yes.
I seen good examples? I can't say that I have in specific of exchange just at the moment in relation to what I've been talking about, because it's all been quite recent, these actions from individual cities. But I mean, I'm sure, I mean, I do know in the discussions that we've had inside the Pascal Observatory, there have been exchanges of good practice.
Yes,
And
it's
I know
getting those informal
historically,
networks happening that's really important. So, and I thank Pascal for leading some of those, which have been very productive. Thank you, Mike, for your insights on today, and I'm pleased that you're going to share your presentation and references with people, because there's a lot of reading in that and a lot of to take away. So thank you very much once again for your for giving us this wealth of knowledge that you have so freely. And I'll now move on to our next speaker, Associate Professor Robbie Guevara, and I've CV is in the chat, but he is an adult community and popular educator with an expertise in education and sustainable development and global citizenship. And I said before that he's president of the International Council for Adult Education, so I won't go over that all again. But he was awarded the Comfia Research Scholarship to conduct research on adult education and resilience in 2016. And he's also been inducted into the International Adult and Continuing Education Hall of Fame in October 2012. And he, again, is a friend of the Global Learning Festival and supports the work of our practitioners tirelessly, which we are very thankful for. Over to you, Robbie.
Good morning, and I'm speaking to you from the lands also of the Wurundjeri and Wurrung peoples. I'm in the city of Glen Eira. If we want to speak to the cities where in Melbourne we are, and I acknowledge also the elders past, present, and emerging, and I acknowledge the peoples of the lands where you and the waterways where you all meet. And so there are just 3 key slides that I'd like to share just to set in context. And I'd like to thank Mike for giving us a more detailed overview of the relationships between the issues that we look at today. And so I've titled the slides around what are the global conversations that are happening, and particularly around the commitments to partnering for education, inclusion, innovation, and transformation. Because I think the first issue that Mike identified is this whole notion of partnership. When we start to look at how do we actually bring together the SDGs, and some of you would have seen this image before. Some people call it the wedding cake, layers and tiers of the SDGs, okay? There are different ways that the SDGs are represented, sometimes in terms of boxes, sometimes as a circle. And in a way, what this acknowledges is that I think the first is to be able to understand the necessity of partnering. And I've always called it also partnering means it's an active process that's ongoing. Okay, the tendency to look when you say partnership or develop partnerships, it becomes very much like an organizational process, that we sign an agreement, we'll work in partners. But what partnering allows us to do is, I think, and as we listen to the presentations today, I think we will be able to find, yes, we have the partnership approach, which is the more institutional approach that governments, local governments might have, okay, to enable them to localize the SDGs. Yes, we will have partnering as it relates to across the SDGs, as Mike very clearly mentioned, that you cannot achieve the education goal alone if you don't achieve the goals on gender, if you don't achieve the goals on inequalities and poverty. But also, the third thing I'd like to do, and this is the academic hat maybe that I'm wearing, is that when we start to look at development, when we start to look at the goal of sustainable development goals, okay, partnering also talks about the way we think about development. And so in terms of conceptually, the interconnections. And so I think in the next presentations, we will see this three different ways that partnering or partnerships occur institutionally, thematically, but also conceptually. Georgia, the next slide. The two other commitments that I think Mike has mentioned, and can you keep just going so people can read the slides? One, I think there's two presses that you have to go through, is and I'm thinking back June this year, we had the Confintia conference, which is the International Adult Education Conference that happens only every 12 years. It happened in Marrakesh, and as Mike said, we were very visible as the International Council of Adult Education, the civil society body that argued for what adult educators need from a civil society perspective. And from our discussions today, when we start to look at the problems that we look at in the potentials of education to address the problems, and when problems, I'm not just talking of COVID, but now particularly the focus that we wanted to look at is this whole notion of how do we look at learning in the workplace. Confintia, the Marrakesh Framework for Action in particular, talks about the workplace as an important site of learning, and we know that. But the key thing that's becoming more evident is that the linear education to work transition is no longer the dominant pattern of education and work, okay? And that the competencies that people will need to learn needs to be learned throughout the life course. So it is life-wide, life-deep, and lifelong, okay? And therefore, for us as educators and for us as people who are even in local government, what are the pathways that are available? And there are three current pathways that are being discussed around the recognition of prior learning, validation and accreditation, but also the value therefore of formal, non-formal, and informal learning in this. One more, Georgia. And I think this goes back, okay? These are ways that we can actually commit to achieving some of these goals around learning and work. But at the heart of what we're trying to also look at is not just the way we partner, but in terms of partnering that is inclusive, acknowledges diversity, puts at the heart of what we do equity, okay? And therefore, this again brings together the approach we do, but the purpose of what we do. The other thing that Mike and Leonie mentioned, and the next slide will introduce you to the Transforming Education Summit that happened in September. So Confintia happened in June. The Transforming Education Summit was the Secretary General's approach to say that I want people to focus on transforming education. Okay. And for those of you who are more familiar with the education discourse that has happened, you will see that the Transforming Education Summit called for four key areas, which sounds like the Delors report in 1996, except that he called for the need to learn, the need to live together, the need to learn to do, and the need to learn to be. Now, it's a longer document, and what does it have to do with work? The area of work, Georgia, one more, is around the learning to do, okay? Acknowledging that the world of work has changed, and the tendency is to look at it from a technological perspective, but that education holds the key to ensuring that workers are prepared for the future, okay? Not just in terms of future, but ongoing, as we said, because of its need to be part of the life course. And therefore, it's important to advocate and embrace the concept of lifelong learning with more flexible pathways, but also financial incentives to allow people to re-engage with education systems several times throughout their lives. There's still a tendency to look at education as the formal education. And so that's one of the tensions that I think we need to be able to recognize that, yes, formal education is important in terms of developing workplace skills and developing world of work, but also it's important for us to recognize the work that cities do, the work that local governments do in nurturing the passion for education, but also developing lifelong learning skills. And so those are the 3 points that I'd like to emphasize. And I'd like now to welcome and introduce people, colleagues, friends who I've worked with, but also have heard about in terms of the kinds of practice we have, particularly here in Australia. And so there are 3 speakers who will share with us today, and they've each been given 5 to 10 minutes. This is not a lot, I know, but if you could look at the time rather than me saying that it's time, but the speakers have been given a chance to explain and actually illustrate some of the things that Mike talked about and some of the things I talked about. So the first speaker I'd like to introduce is Maria Dimitriou, who's the local coordinator of the Multiversity Project. And I'm not going to go into the project, so she can speak to that. This can now be followed by a friend, Professor Bruce Wilson from RMIT, who reflects on the Multiversity Project, okay, and bring it up to the more, as I said, we're not just talking of the partnering, we're talking of the conceptual level. And then we have Meena Barji, who speaks to us again to looking at pathways. I talked about the value of pathways in creating and in particularly relating it back to the industry. And hopefully at the end of the session, we will have time for interaction, and we will again continue to invite you to put your questions or comments in the chat box, and our colleagues will harvest what's in the chat box. So welcome, Maria.
Thank you, Robbie. You're a hard act to follow. So we'll go to the next slide. So I'm Maria Dimitriou, I'm the Coordinator of Local Employment Partnerships, and I just want to give you some context on where is Hume. It's located in Melbourne's Northern Fringe, just 15 kilometres from the centre of Melbourne. And it spans over 504 square kilometres, and it's one of Australia's fastest growing and culturally diverse communities. I'm not going to go into detail, the slide explains it all. So we'll go to the next slide, and because I know I'm aware that I've only got 10 minutes. So the next slide just shows us the history of the Multiversity, and what we're trying to achieve is connecting business, education, and community. And we're trying to create an innovation ecosystem, which provides through the provision of a range of programs and services which raise local aspiration and build opportunity. And we've adopted an economic development approach to the initiative. It was launched in March 2012, at a time where educational attainment and retention in Hume were lower than that of Greater Melbourne. And our founding members were Victoria University, La Trobe, Kangan and Deakin. What prompted the introduction of the Multiversity was that there was an absence of a bricks and mortar university in Hume, and the only tertiary education provider, and it still is Kangan Institute. The intent of Hume Multiversity was to bring higher education offerings by Multiversity partners to Hume by delivering courses at council-run facilities, such as our global learning centres and libraries. So it was about making tertiary education accessible and inclusive to our community. It's a council-led initiative modelled on collaborative partnerships. There's been an increased commitment from council since 2018, and it's embedded in council plan. And it falls under our strategic objective 1.1, which states creating learning opportunities for everyone to reach their potential through all stages of their lives. There have been challenges over the decade as the initiative evolved, and the main one being maintaining momentum and relevance and being adaptive, because COVID lockdowns was something that we didn't anticipate, and it led to education institutions and everyone pivoting to online rather than face-to-face delivery. But this was a great opportunity for Hume Multiversity, as what we found during the pandemic is our residents had a thirst for upskilling and learning. Engagement during COVID increased, and it also provided us the opportunity to partner with Coursera to provide free online micro-credentials, as well as other partners offering a series of workshops and online programs, which had a strong take-up by our businesses. Maintaining collaboration was also a challenge and important, but this was addressed through the establishment of a steering group of all partners who developed a joint program logic and vision for the multiversity moving forward. And it's also enabled cross-organisational and cross-institutional partnerships. Over the years, partners have committed and recommitted to to multiversity due to their own organisational restructures. But even within council, we had our own organisational realignments. And in 2018, I took carriage. It was reassigned to the Economic Development Department. We've adopted an economic development lens. Bruce Wilson was integral in us to move, taking it forward. Yeah, and we couldn't just look at the delivery of courses alone. It had to sustain this collaborative partnership model. Multiversity needed to offer more than just training courses. And so the key lessons for me during this journey has been a commitment. There had to be a collective commitment to collaboration, governance to provide stewardship and the strategic direction to the work, which also is an enabler for the collaboration, a collective vision that aligns to council's vision, but also each of our partners' strategic vision. So when Multiversity was relaunched in 2019, we went from 2 partners to 9 signatories, and now we have 11. And all partners have signed memorandums of understanding and have committed to our Hume community. But we review the activity agreements regularly and adapt them according to community needs and priorities. Next slide, thanks. So this just shows us multiversity, and basically, as I said before, we're trying to create an innovation ecosystem, and it's a partnership between leading tertiary institutions, industry bodies, and Hume City Council. Multiversity partners can choose to participate in the multiversity under 6 pillars, and they are training courses and pathways, workforce development, internships, and work integrated learning, collaboration and problem solving, community research, and entrepreneurship. I think it has also provided a platform for multiversity partners to trial new approaches to curriculum. If we could go to the next slide. This infographic outlines what has been achieved since its relaunch and the multiple collaborations, and many of which were delivered during COVID. It also demonstrates the scope and breadth of the multiversity. You can see there are a raft of programs being delivered to support people with pathways to employment through to skills training, education, and entrepreneurship. So I will, in the next slide, I will discuss my first case study, and that's the partnership between Victoria University and Council. So basically, VU rejoined the multiversity in 2020 with a significant financial commitment. We have a 5-year funding agreement with VU, which ends in 2025. And you can see what the total investment is. Half of this investment is in the provision of a seconded position within my team, and as well as funding attached to that seconded position to roll out programs and initiatives based on priorities identified in our community and aligned to the Hume Multiversity, as well as to VU in community. The financial investment has been important as it has elevated Hume Multiversity as well as VU in community. So it's a win-win for all, and Council and VU co-fund projects together. The partnership has achieved the following. There's been some significant achievements since 2020. One being we've got 90 Bachelor of Early Childhood Education students, or Hume residents or Hume workers currently enrolled in a Hume-specific tailored program. VU delivered a Skills and Careers Your Way in 2021, where 8 women completed the program to support them re-enter the workforce or change their careers. Another one, which probably also aligns to the Sustainable Development Goals, is VU and Hume are a key partner to collaborate to thrive, a project that supports Hume business transition to the circular economy. It's also enabled the co-funding of community research. So recently we just finished on engaging the Pathways in Place team to map out the community assets in the Hume jobs and skills ecosystem. And they undertook a gaps analysis. This will help us inform the priorities and programs moving forward. It's also enabled collaboration between multiversity partners. So it's formalised and fast-tracked articulation for Kangan Diploma of Early Childhood students into the Bachelor of Early Childhood Education. The Hume-specific Early Childhood course was co-designed with Council, Victoria University and Kangan Institute, and it provides a flexible delivery model online and in person at council-led facilities to support Hume staff and residents to overcome barriers in accessing the Bachelor of Early Childhood, which has seen an increased demand due to population growth and the introduction of 3-year-old kinder. It's provided a solution to those wishing to upskill and allows students to complete their bachelor in 2 years, taking advantage of VU's block model delivery. The success of this course has provided the impetus for VU to access additional funding and roll this out statewide. Next slide. I'm hoping how am I going for time?
1 minute.
You've got
Maria.
about 1 minute, yeah.
Oh my God. Okay, so this is just another, as a response to COVID, as part of COVID-19's recovery, Council's COVID-19 recovery and reactivation plan. We launched the Hume Multiversity Tertiary Education Scholarships in 2021. So, and they're the partners that are participating in our scholarship program. The intent is to make tertiary education more accessible for our Hume residents and to support their retention in their studies and their first years of enrolling. So to date, there's been a $320,000 investment, and we've awarded 72 scholarships collectively. So the next slide just indicates the impact that the scholarships, and these are some quotes from students, that it's had on recipients that are Hume residents also. And basically it's evident that it's raised their aspiration, motivation and commitment to their studies, as well as being the difference between them starting a tertiary education qualification or not. And it's helped ease some of the financial burden of accessing education. The next slide is just shows us our partners to date, and they're quite diverse. And finally, thank you for providing me with the opportunity to present and showcase some of our work in Hume. I would like to acknowledge Dr. Leonie Wheeler and Professor Bruce Wilson, who were integral in the early days with the mapping, ideation and development of the Hume Multiversity. And Bruce was also integral to the relaunch and the development of the 6 pillars in 2018. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Maria, and thank you for doing my work to introduce Bruce and put Bruce in context. But I hope, as I said, people were following and you were very clear about the conceptual area that you start with economic development, but then you realize you cannot just have economic development without education, but it's not just about service education or education provision, but you talk about governance and the role of having policy. So very clearly illustrating the interrelationships. And I'd like to invite Bruce now to maybe connect back to the story, okay? And Bruce and I work at RMIT, but clearly we have extensions beyond our university even not being a partner in this, but conceptually and spiritually, I guess Bruce has always been part. And Bruce actually introduced me to the Hume Global Learning Village and now to the Multiversity. Thank you, Bruce.
Well, thanks, Robbie. And let me acknowledge that I'm on the land of the Woiwurrung and the Bunurong traditional custodians and pay my respects to their elders past, present and emerging. And it's a real privilege to be part of this conversation and particularly following Maria and her comments. I think one of the things that's sometimes underestimated is the significance of Maria having a long-term commitment to this project. I'm not quite sure when you began, Maria, but it's 5, 6, 7, 8 years that you've been doing it. And your boss, whom I also know very well, George Osborne, goes back through that full decade of commitment to seeing this project develop. And I think we shouldn't underestimate the importance of people who sit behind the scenes in some ways, but really just keep the process going. And I'd include Leonie in that, as Maria has just said. Leonie and I were part of the Hume Global Learning Village committee and board for 15 or so years, was it, Leonie? I forget exactly how long, and privileged again to see how local government can lead very, very important partnership work. 3 simple messages from me. The first is that building place-based innovation capability, innovation systems matters for places' prosperity and for their sustainability. So a focus on innovation is important. Second key message is that learning is integral to innovation processes, innovation systems, and yet it's learning that's not that which is typically thought of when we talk about education. It's specifically about informal, about non-formal learning, and the kinds of things that occur in all sorts of, if you like, in the cracks, in the spaces between formal learning rather than in places like universities themselves. And the third important message is about collaboration. And I'm emphasizing a theme that Mike, Robbie, Maria have all emphasized, that no one entity can do this by themselves. So yes, let's start by a quick comment about the Multiversity. It's not unique. There are other similar kinds of examples. We first heard about, got the idea of the Multiversity, I think perhaps from an initiative in Kent, when under the banner of Pascal in 2005, we supported 5 educators from the Hume area going to Kent, which was a partner in Pascal at that time, and looking at the Medway example where 3, I think it was, universities had come together to work with local community partners. So our Multiversity is not unique, but it's very distinctive. And what is distinctive about the Hume Multiversity is that it's been going for a decade, and that in itself is an uncommon factor. The emphasis on collaboration matters, and this slide really kind of reaffirms that the points I've made already. But let me focus on this bottom point about proximity, aggregation, and knowledge spillovers. What happens when you bring people together in particular physical relationships with each other? It doesn't have to be under the same roof, but it has to be close enough that people are alert to each other's activities and are able to connect with them. Aggregation is about bringing some critical mass into the system and getting people who have shared interests and possibilities to connect with each other. And the knowledge spillovers, that what happens in the cracks, in the spaces between organisations in the spaces that occur in quite informal settings, and it's that sense of spillovers. It's even what happens when people move from employment in one organisation to another. They take that knowledge with them, they take the relationships with them, and they continue to sustain them in one way or another. Now, let's go to the next two slides quite quickly, Georgia. This first one, Mike especially will recognise this from a former colleague of ours, John Goddard, in the UK, who commented on the way in which universities so often separate themselves out from other key partners. And it's not only the universities do that. We all know how government can segment itself and become a bit of a silo, and even trying to engage with government from outside can be very difficult. Businesses are preoccupied with getting on with the job, with ensuring their own viability, their own markets, their own activities, and if you don't have people who can connect those different kinds of critical parts of our neighbourhoods, of our communities, then what you get is the disconnected region. And if we flick to the next slide, what John pointed out was the importance of trying to build the connected region, where we've got strong partnerships, where people recognise that collaboration is not necessarily easy, but you have got a framework which allows tertiary education institutions to see the importance of their connections with the private sector, and just as importantly with government agencies. And so let's go to the next slide, please. So to be specific about learning and innovation, I think one of the important things to make is that the kinds of partnerships that Mike, Robbie, and Maria have talked about are not easy. There are differences in languages, in the resources, in the interests and the priorities of each of those different kinds of institutions. And if I just speak for a second about universities, since the 1990s, government policy has positioned universities very much as part of a market. We compete. We compete for students. We compete for research resources, and so that puts us in a position where collaborating with others is not so tricky. We've got to make sure that we're distinctive, and that we're sustaining our brand, and that we're able to continue to be successful in that marketplace of knowledge. Similar kinds of things can be said about the interests of government. Government is very concerned about probity, about proper use of resources, about compliance with policy, about ensuring that its governance relationships are properly managed. Business is concerned about making a dollar, about getting on and surviving in the sometimes very competitive marketplaces that they want. And yet each of these entities needs to see how their particular interests, how their priorities do in fact connect and coincide with others. And that's not something that you can take for granted. And that's why the work that the Global Learning Village did, that Maria and her colleagues continue to do, is crucial in bridging those potential barriers that can arise in the different sorts of language that we use. Within those entities, this idea of absorptive capacity is really important. It's obviously a bit of academic jargon, but it points to the fact that just because new knowledge is available, new insights, new learning is available, it's not necessarily going to be taken up within other partners or within other organisations. Organisations need to have an explicit understanding of how they can learn themselves, how they can broach new knowledge, how they can incorporate the learning of new knowledge into their own processes. And this comes to my third dot point on this slide, that whilst formal learning can support capability development, when we're talking about innovation ecosystems, so much more learning occurs in the informal processes and environments. Much of that can be within an organisation. It can be in team meetings. It can be through online resources of one kind or another. It can be through the way that people use the web even. But it also occurs in pubs and in coffee shops. And I think just about anybody who's on this webinar who knows me at all will know that some of my best work is done in a coffee shop. because that's where you get the opportunity to just kind of get into the interaction with the people that you're with, to really listen to them, to really try and explore particular issues and particular points. And I want to, in my last comment, endorse the theme that's run through right from Mike's contribution at the start, that when we're talking about innovation and talking about innovation ecosystems, it's not just about the economy, it is about socio-ecological innovation as well. And my colleagues Lars Kernan and Kevin Morgan wrote a very good academic article about this a couple of years ago. They demonstrated how you cannot in fact have effective innovation systems that support business development without also having innovation that supports socio-ecological innovation. Today, of course, we're conducting this webinar in the same not immediate time zone, but as COP27 is underway in Egypt. We have a climate crisis. We are in an emergency situation. We have no choice but to think about how we are going to do things differently in the future. We cannot continue to do things the way that they have been. We need transformation, innovation, and the learning associated with innovation is crucial to our being able to find a way through this crisis and sustain our communities for decades to come. Thanks very much.
Thank you very much, Bruce. And again, thank you for giving us the transition to the next presentation around the whole notion of innovation. We've been looking at the whole, link, as Mike started with a project that was university-based. I brought it back to the global commitments. Maria talked about bringing it back local. Bruce focused us on place-based and the necessity for having this idea of aggregation with similar experiences. And then now the whole notion that part of that is non-formal learning is innovation, but at the same time, what we have is there are aspects of working in innovative partnerships that we have. And I invite our next speaker, Mina, to speak to us about an innovative partnership with the construction industry. So Mina, thank you very much. You've got your 10 minutes. Thanks, Bruce. Welcome, Mina.
Thank you. Thanks for the introduction, Robbie. So I'm going to talk about the project that we ran, Construction Pathways, that focused on creating career pathways to the construction industry for diverse communities. I'd like to start by acknowledging that I'm joining this meeting from the traditional land of the Kulin Nations and pay my respects to elders past and present. City of Melton is a local government area in Victoria, Australia, and is the second fastest growing municipality in Victoria with a population of 181,223 residents based on 2021 census. Melton, as a learning city, believes in enabling people of all ages from diverse socio-economic and cultural backgrounds to benefit from inclusive and equitable quality education and lifelong learning opportunities. This type of project is not new in Melton. In 2014, Building Melton Together project was developed by Economic Development Team and Lifelong Learning Party. And the initiative was launched to address unemployment, particularly youth unemployment, and aim to increase local jobs in the city of Melton and to align vocational training and skills development to industries where job opportunities exist in the city. This project was designed as a direct result of COVID-19 to address local community unemployment and supporting community members finding jobs in the construction industry, which is considered one of the biggest industries in Melton municipality. The main objective of this project was to increase employability and upskilling 100 residents from top 8 culturally and linguistically diverse communities of Melton by providing a free WorkSafe white card qualification and using a nationally accredited interpreter. For those who are not familiar with white card, a white card is a work card issued to individuals that complete the required training for setting foot on a construction site in Australia. And the card is a mandatory requirement for anyone working on a construction site and demonstrate that the card holder understands common construction hazards. So the project's aim was to provide entry-level requirement for construction industry positions such as cleaners, labourers, outdoor workers, including landscaping, fencing, gardening, maintenance, as well as building site workers such as painters, plasterers, and site cleaners. Another objective of the project was to provide a career pathway for the community into the construction industry by getting assistance from facilitated training and recruitment specialists so they can directly link participants with employers and support them to build up capacity and become job ready. And finally, the project aimed to increase awareness of the variety of education and employment opportunities available across the municipality. Based on the project objectives, 1 day of wildcard training was provided in participants' preferred language, using an accredited interpreter to ensure that the concept of safety is fully understood and English proficiency is not a barrier to learning or employment. Also, an information session facilitated by recruitment specialists was provided to give career advice, link the participants with construction employers in the area or register participants with this service so they can provide additional support like skill identification, resume writing, and referrals to other training opportunities. As a result of this project, 121 community members from diverse backgrounds were upskilled with free wildcard qualification. The project target was upskilling 100 community members, and we were able to deliver the training to additional 21 participants by building strong partnerships with local providers. Overall, we had 30 participants who were able to use this certificate to secure or maintain employment in construction industry or other relevant job opportunities that required wildcard, including factories and commercial cleaning. English proficiency was identified as a barrier to employment and learning to majority of these participants, and we overcame this barrier by providing accredited interpreters to translate the course material and explain the concept of safety to the participants. Another major outcome was providing a career pathway information session for the community. As a result of these information sessions, a total of 49 people were either registered with Jobs Victoria Employment Services or Jobs Victoria Advocates, which supported the community to become job ready and improve their employability skills. We are also able to share information and resources in participants' preferred language to raise awareness about the variety of education and employment opportunities that are available to them in the area. Now I'd like to meet Sai. He's one of our participants that joined this training. So Sai is originally from Burma and he arrived in Australia in March 2016. He used to work at Crown Casino in Melbourne. However, he lost his job due to COVID-19 and lockdowns. He was very concerned at the time because he needed to provide for his family, and he had tried getting the wildcard in the past, but he was turned down due to his English proficiency and ability to complete the written assessment. So I heard about the free wildcard training that was offered in his own language using an interpreter through Melton City Council. So he registered and successfully passed the written assessment and now has his wildcard. Sai's highlight of the training is to be safe at all times and the importance of wearing safety gear, especially helmet. He has been able to secure employment in the construction industry as a concreter. Sai believes this type of training and ability to secure a job has supported him and his family very much financially because he's able to earn more money working overtime and on the weekends and be financially independent. So I also emphasize the importance of delivering trainings in particular languages, as most of his community have their skills and are employable, but cannot pass the tests in English. Sai is also interested in getting his forklift license in future, and his dream job is to have his own chicken farm. So it comes to our learnings. This project aimed to provide a training for top 8 demographic groups in the municipality in their own languages. While the response and registrations from recently arrived communities such as Burmese, Karen, and Chin was so high, the response from more settled communities very slow or no interest were expressed. Based on the conversations with various groups and community members, this could be due to newly arrived communities willing to upskill and enter job force and secure entry-level employment, while more settled communities might be past entry-level jobs and require further training, including forklift license, hospitality certificates, or other vocational trainings to progress their employment journey. Moving forward, Melton City Council has committed additional $10,000 to support continuing the delivery of free wildcard training, focusing on other suburbs of Melton municipality. Our next project is Hospitality Pathways and creating career pathways to the hospitality industry. Additional $20,000 funding has been secured to offer qualifications in hospitality industry to enable community members to attain ongoing employment locally. These qualifications include barista, responsible serving of alcohol, food hygiene, and cafe skills. And we're really looking forward to upskilling 80 more local residents and supporting them to enter hospitality industry. That brings me to the end of my presentation, and thank you so much for listening.
Thank you very much, Mina, and thanks for the story of Sai. And I think one of the things that you highlight really is, as the conversation has been proceeding, is the whole idea of the link to industry skills. And I like it when you talk about, aside from the fact that you deliver it in the local language, you said there was something to do with having a recruiter there as well, so that people in not just the industry of construction, but the people who help transition people were there and they see what you do. Okay, and so I think part of that is, even though you might say not everybody gets employed directly, I think just being in learning, and as Bruce talked about, that people are able to re-engage back in learning is a very important step. And that you do that in a very innovative way in terms of language, but also in terms of bringing it to the industry. So I think we've had very good examples. Thanks to Mina, thanks to Bruce, and thanks to Maria for bringing us these examples and bringing us, and Mike giving us the overall framework. I think Mike had to leave for another presentation. This is the nature of the Global Learning Festival, where people can be tapped at different times of the day. And so are there any questions or any comments that people will have around the conversation? So if we could have, I don't know, if we could have the speakers, what do you call them, pinned up, so we can all be visible to each other and people can have a conversation. I think there's some comments from Adam. It's a complete wrap around service. The model adds so much value beyond qualifications. Yep. And this again goes back to the notion that Bruce talked about. This whole notion of informal qualification is important. Okay. And I think that's the visible side of it. But I think what's emerging from our conversation today is we're making the innovation the aspect that we need to make visible. How do we make visible what's happening? And Bruce used a term in terms of things that you don't notice that's happening, but we see it happening, okay, around the development of, and that's why I called it partnering, because often we might see the partnership that signed agreement, but the processes of how we get there, the ongoing ways that we maintain these relationships. And, you know, and I think it was Leonie that introduced me to the term, this whole, I think, the partnership broker and the role that local councils can have in brokering. And again, I don't want the term brokering because it's an economic term, but the whole notion of the things that we do on the background. And I think it's important to make this visible, because we don't just deliver learning and courses. We actually create the environment, and this is where the innovation comes in, create the environment for these kinds of learning to happen. And so I think the two things also that I've noticed from both Maria in Mina's presentation is there's funding that it generated again. So the good practice generated more funding. And that was one of the things that I think a lot of innovative education programs are hoping, that we don't just create policy frameworks, we also create resourcing capacity to be able to do this good practice. So I'm trying to look at the chat. If there's none in the chat, maybe I'd invite either Maria, Bruce, or Mina, or Leonie to give us some insights, hearing across the different stories. Is there something that you think, oh, I should have said that? Please feel free to identify and raise your hands, or just open your microphone. And
I can
we could
say
have
something.
Mina. Yeah, Leonie. Thanks, Leonie.
I would just follow on from your term about broker as an economic term. The more I'm working with practitioners in local government, the more I know that they're learning facilitators. And one thing that I had a conversation with a person from Brimbank, and she said to me, she's the go-to person. So they know what's going on in their local community. So they know about the neighbourhood houses, they know what's going on industry-wide, and they're in the local government, so they can ask questions across portfolios as well. And I think that we've seen two good examples in Maria and Mina, both as learning facilitators. And I know that there's that as Adam said in the chat, that this is going to build in Melton. And as it is already in Hume, I've had a conversation with someone about entrepreneurship and youth hubs, and I know that Multiversity is involved in that. So it just, one thing builds, one building block builds on another. That's my comment anyway. Thank you very much for your presentations. They were, you know, brings it all real, the theory real on the ground.
Thanks, Leonie. Maria?
And another element that I'm involved in, because Multiversity is just one element of the work that economic development does. Can everyone hear me? Yeah. So I oversee what's called the Hume Local Jobs for Local People program also, which is pretty much based on a lot of the work that you're doing, Mina, but we are seen as the trusted neutral brokers between industry and community, and it's about prioritizing local residents for the employment opportunities, because Hume is such a huge growth area with so many opportunities, and some of the innovation has come out of local jobs for local people also, in terms of like when Highland Shopping Centre opened, for example, back in 2012, we embarked on a very similar journey, Mina, in terms of a hospitality type program. And it's always around looking at what, sometimes if there's no, because in the early days, we started with no funding, very minimal funding. So I feel as if it's also about looking, partnerships are important because you need to see where the funding is and how you leverage of that to create opportunities in your community. So.
Yes, thanks. Any other, there's a question, but I can pick up while we're waiting for other comments. Eric asks, I often think of adult education as the root system feeding the tree of public institutions like the cracks, but how does a strand of the roots build and influence the larger institutions and get their interests? And so in terms of the role of adult learning, don't get me started there, but I just think the first thing in terms of Eric's comment is making adult education visible, or maybe, and now we actually call it adult learning and education, because it's, when you talk of adult education, it tends to be, people think it's formal, that adults have to go back to school to learn. But we're thinking, yes, formal learning is important, but at the same time, given what Bruce, Mina, and Maria is talking about, it's adults learning to identify opportunities. It's adult learning to identify what is it that I want. Okay, and it's part of that recognition of what is it that I want, what skills do I have, what opportunities are in my local area, that I don't have to go somewhere else. And part of that is a facilitation of that conversation. And part of that is recognizing that adults are creating their own pathways. But unless you provide opportunities, unless you have programs like what Mina and Maria and Bruce are talking about, then adults might not identify hooks or opportunities. But also, going back to learning can also be sometimes a not threatening, but it's you need the confidence to take the first step. And I think what these kinds of projects gives are opportunities for people to see, oh, I can do that. Okay. But I think maybe Jenny can pick up a bit more about adult education. But before I pass on to Jenny from Adult Learning Australia, is there anything else? I just saw a chat come up. There's a question from Maria. Do you sit within the economic development or community development team? Maria, you said economic development.
Yeah, economic development. And I think that's important because I feel the industry, because it's not as much as a community capacity building piece as also as a industry capability piece. So I think it needs to be both, and I think economic development has got the industry connections and can bring understands where the growth in jobs, where the investment is taking place, where the jobs are, and can work with developers and businesses to create these kind of approaches. So,
okay.
Can I just make one comment there, Maria? But also, your boss understands lifelong learning. You have a manager that understands the concept of lifelong learning and adult education. I think that's a real advantage as well that you have.
Yep. And I also come from an adult education background because I used to manage an RTO. So prior to my stint in council and employment program. So
there you go, Maria, making that visible. Okay. And I think I pick up from what Bruce said. What we're looking for is, I think Bruce talked socio-ecological to link the social, the environment, but we can say socio-economic, ecological innovation. The whole notion that it's this bringing back to this whole notion of conceptual clarity of development is not just economic development. And Maria's example of culturally diverse, cultural development, okay, is as important. Community development in a sense because of a place. And when you talk of place, it's not just physical place, but you're talking of language, culturally diverse groups that find themselves in a new home. I think what you've brought up is really, you've opened up opportunities for us to see across different themes and entry points. Bruce has given us a bit of a clarity in terms of a framework that allows us to be rooted back in place. And I hope that because this is the Global Learning Festival, that you are able to see that there are commitments globally that we can draw on. You can draw on the commitment that the Secretary General has made in the Transforming Education Summit, but also you can draw on some of the commitments that we've had in Conventia. So with that, can I ask everybody if we can do a round of applause, if we can just clap. There's a little icon that you can clap, I think, in the chat, or maybe not in this particular function. It's only raised hand, but yay! And for those in the chat, thank you very much for giving us the opportunity to be able to share our stories with you. And hopefully that these stories allow you to therefore be inspired. Okay. And for those who are listening to the recording in the Global Learning Festival, I'd like to again thank the opportunity for us to be able to come together, and for the Global Learning Festival to give us the opportunity to be able to outreach to the world. And so I'd like to invite my friend and colleague, Jenny, to bring us around in terms of linking it back to what's happening at the moment, the issues that where all these stories need to come into fruition again within a framework of policy, within a framework of practice. So I'd like to introduce Jenny McCaffer, the CEO of Adult Learning Australia. Thanks, Jenny.
Yeah, thank you. What a whirl of information, really. I was trying to take notes and I couldn't keep up, and it's so exciting that there are so many things happening at a local level, and it was really good to hear those local examples, but also the wider sort of international level, and then bring it down to sort of local place-based organisations that are really trying to make a difference. So I thought I'd just start a little bit with, obviously we had a change of federal government in this country in the middle of this year, and one of the key election promises was to look at jobs. So in September, they held the Jobs and Skills Summit, and Adult Learning Australia, which is a national peak for adult and community education, as well as a voice for community learners, was invited to participate. So I went along there, and it was interesting because there was a mix of industry, unions, employers and civil society. Initially, I understand it was meant to be the Jobs Summit, but then there was a push for it to be around jobs and skills. I was lucky enough to sit near the Prime Minister and the Treasurer, and I did thank them for inviting me, but I did mention that it would have been better to be a Job, Skills and Education Summit. So I tried to, have that input. One of the things that the critical role of that Jobs and Skills Summit was to focus on the critical role of vocational education and training in terms of national recovery. And the government has announced initiatives since then to grow productivity, boost security in jobs and wages, reduce the pay gap, especially the gender pay gap. And we know that gender equity is one of the key aspects in terms of the SDGs. Skills migration, integrating training and work pathways, focusing on sectors like the care sector where they know that there are job gaps, and developing a high quality workforce with skills in VET to deliver the outcomes that they want. In recent weeks, the Jobs and Skills Authority has actually been established. It's passed both houses, and they've merged the National Skills Commission into the new authority. Now, we're yet to see what the full mandate is of the Jobs and Skills Authority, but ALA is working with the Department of Education and Work Relations, where on their Foundation Skills Advisory Group, along with some other community organisations, TAFE and some businesses. But there seems to be no real place for a focus on adult education in terms of informal and informal learning, non-formal and informal learning. So adult education per se, and as Robbie has said, is an issue that really sort of falls in between the cracks. And a number of people have said that. Bruce has said that today. It's one of the areas that really needs to be included in terms of national policy. So we have been meeting with not just Brendan O'Connor, who's the Minister for Skills and Training. We met with Tony Burke's office and his advisors, and he's the Minister for Workplace Relations. We're in the process of trying to meet with the Minister for Education, Jason Clare, and we've worked alongside some of our colleagues like Robbie and others in terms of trying to influence Australia's agenda at New York at the TES. I think that was in, Robbie, was that what month was that, Robbie? Was that
in September?
September. So and we managed to include adult education and vocational education in the Australian National Statement to the UN on transforming education. People may or may not be aware, but there's an employment white paper, terms of reference, that's circulating from the department, and they're open to comments until the 30th of November. So we can send that link if people are interested. But I did want to just pull out some of the things from the presentations today and link them into some of the local stories that we're hearing really need to be heard at a higher level in terms of national policy and attention paid to local governments and local communities that can deliver on the ground. So we know that no one SDG operates in isolation, but that SDG 4 is a pivotal goal that can bring communities together. So, and the place-based sort of multilateral partnerships that people talked about, where there's real commitment and a willingness, are ways to really make change. Learning in the workplace, learning through life course, and identifying learning pathways. I think, and Robbie talked about putting equity in the heart, and I think that there is that priority at a national level. Leaving no one behind is one of the critical objectives of the government, and I think it's our place to remind them that local communities can provide opportunities to ensure that people aren't left behind, that education holds the key to ensure workers are prepared for the future, and that we really need to embrace a culture of lifelong learning. And I have to say, after meeting with the Minister, Brendan O'Connor, 2 weeks ago, I was interested to note that in his tweets now, he's talking about lifelong learning, because that's not really in his portfolio. His is specifically skills and training, but I have noticed that he's talked about lifelong learning. He's also talked about skills for work and life. So hopefully we've had some influence on him to broaden his horizons. It's really good to see that Hume residents have had a thirst for learning after the pandemic, and that having a commitment to agreed priorities can really make a difference, especially when it's backed up with financial investment. And that's something we really need to have from all levels of government and from all partners. I really like the statement from Maria that we need collaboration to thrive. And I think that's really at the heart of what we're looking at here. The other thing that was pulled out by Bruce, and I think it's really important that we're not talking about a short-term process, that we need to have long-term, we need to identify and respond to short-term issues, sure, but we need to be in this for the long term. And we need to build on the place-based approach. The other thing that I picked up from Bruce was that I haven't really heard about this before. I've often talked about informal and non-formal learning being the kind of mortar that fits between more formalised learning, but Bruce talked about the spillover learning, so I really like that concept, which he said happens in pubs, at team meetings and those sorts of things. So I think that we also need to look more broadly beyond those sort of formal qualifications and get government to recognise the important role of those spillover learning opportunities, and also how much people can absorb, what capacity people have to absorb learning in a changing world where there's lots of demands on them. And it was great to hear the real life stories from both Melton and Hume, and both those municipalities I know pretty well. I grew up in, spent my younger years in Broadmeadows in Hume, and I've done a lot of work in both of those municipalities. But to see how those real stories, the real stories where people's lives changed, particularly the local resident who had come from Burma, just to see how their lives changed, and the role of local government in doing that, and the role of leadership and entrepreneurship that people bring. So I just wanted to end by saying it's been a fantastic opportunity to hear so many different views, but I really like, and I think it was, I'm not sure if it was Robbie or Bruce, but who said we really have no choice to think about how we do things in the future. We need to act now. We need learning, innovation and collaboration now. So I think I'll leave it there. Thank you.
Oh, thank you very much, Jenny. I'm the person that is concluding this this presentation, and I just have to say a really, really, really big thank you to our speakers and our audience for your participation. And just to let you know, we'll be sharing this presentation and feedback notes with our attendees after the session. If you're interested in learning more about Adult Learning Australia and the Australian Learning Communities Network, I think that our URLs will go up in the chat, and we will send you out a short survey after this webinar which evaluates the session. And if any of you are interested in sharing your story about what it's been like for you as a participant to attend this presentation or any other presentation at the Global Learning Festival, because there's over 50 events and it finishes this evening. And I know the Irish Learning Cities Network is talking this evening, so if you haven't got anything to do tonight, you can go on the Global Learning Festival website and hear about them. Our student Isabel Incham is willing to speak to you participants further about what was impactful for you about attending the Global Learning Festival or about today's session. And thank you for coming today.
Thanks everyone for coming along.
Thank you. Thanks very much indeed, everybody. Hope it's been worthwhile. I've certainly enjoyed it, so thank you.
Thank
Thank
you.
you.